Welcome back to another episode of The History Blokes, the podcast where we discuss the facts, key events, people and strange happenings in Australian history we think you ought to know. We try to tell these things in a way that you wouldn't have experienced in your classroom. I'm Chris McComb.
And I'm Conan Elphick, as ever.
And we're coming to you from Ngunnawal country here in Canberra. So this week we have another anniversary most Australians are unlikely to be aware of. Is that right, Conan?
Correct, yes. It's the anniversary, Chris, of Decimalisation, where Australia transitioned from pounds, shillings and pence to dollars and cents, which took place on the 14th of February, Valentine's Day, 1966. The reason I wanted to look at it is because anyone over the age of 65 or so would be well aware of decimalisation. They would have experienced it themselves. But for anyone under that age, they might be aware that it took place, but not what the significance of it was. It was a milestone on that road towards self-identity, which we often refer back to on this podcast, don't we? So,
in some respects, another step away from old Blighty.
Yes, yeah, quite. Yeah, so it was all part of that sort of that post-war process of detaching itself from the UK. After the Second World War and the failure of Britain to protect Australia from the Japanese, really there became this sort of transition to seeing America as more of its main ally rather than Britain.
In some respects, by moving from the pound to the dollar, is almost reflective of the journey.
Quite, yeah, that's right. And the other thing that's interesting about it is that it was an extraordinary public relations triumph and a logistical triumph. But before we get into the detail, there's just a couple of admin things. Before we get onto the quiz,
we're going to go quiz, aren't we?
You would, of course, be quizzed, Chris. You know how much I enjoy that. A reminder to everyone to follow, rate and review, or whatever else one does with podcasts. Okay, so the quiz, Chris. Number one, what is a florin?
Well, it's obviously a coinage,
yes.
Part of a currency, and I don't know what it would be worth though in terms of converting it to say the modern dollar. Is it like 20 cents or something to that effect?
That's reasonably close. We'll address these questions during the podcast.
Certainly.
And at the end, as usual. The holy dollar was made from what coin?
Silver. Oh, sorry. Sorry, metal. Please cut that bit out.
You're right, it was silver.
Okay, thank you very much. It was made from the 20-cent coin.
Incorrect. The first 50-cent coin contained 75% what and was what shape?
It was silver and it was circular.
Very good. Present-day coins are made from an alloy of which metals?
I'm going to suggest copper and tin.
Which direction will King Charles be facing when the new coins come out?
He'll be facing to the left because his mother faced to the right, and there's some precedence around that, isn't it? Switching them around each time. Right,
okay. So
I can't believe I even remotely knew that one.
Now, before we get into money in the European sense, I just want to talk a little bit about First Nations trading. Now, obviously, they didn't have currency as such, but they traded. Different clans traded amongst each other, sometimes over vast distances. And they also traded with people outside of Australia. So from about 1700 until 1907, when it was shut down by European colonists, hundreds of fishermen from each year came from Makassar, which is the island of Sulawesi in Indonesia, came to the Arnhem coast to buy sea cucumbers from Aboriginal people. No, I think they came to fish them there. They fished them themselves, set up camp for a few weeks, and they would trade with Aboriginal people for various things there. And they bored it down, dried it on their boats, and traded it with China, where it is still used for food and medicine. They met about a third of China's trepang needs.
Wow, that's extraordinary.
These Macassars were, anyway. In the Torres Strait, many items were traded with neighbours in Papua New Guinea and mainland Australia, as you would expect. But in effect, Australia was crisscrossed by extensive trade routes, which I believe coincided with the Song Lines, if you're familiar with those.
Indeed.
Yeah, Bruce Chapman wrote that famous and fascinating book about it. And in the interior, you would have sort of weapons, red ochre, pearl shell, and stone became common items of trade. Pearl shell from the Kimberley was traded inland thousands of kilometres, and this is sort of what's interesting. It sort of changed its meaning and purpose as it travelled. So kind of what the interesting distinction is between how Aboriginal people traded and how Europeans trade now and traditionally, is that for us it is obviously very transactional, but it was far more nuanced amongst Aboriginal people. So for them it was an ancient and pre-designated passage through the landscape, often mapped out in song, as we said, for the purpose of meeting at particular locations of great cultural and mythical importance, and then ceremonially exchanging, renewing or reinforcing friendship rights with other groups, clans or nations. And at these locations, goods, objects or dreaming songs were passed from one group to another. So the transaction itself was imbued with a folkloric or mythical significance.
It's a transaction of knowledge,
yes,
as much as it is a transaction of material good.
And so it was sort of very much part of, it was a cultural undertaking rather than simply a way of getting hold of whatever it was you needed or wanted. Now, so foreign coins were used in the early days of the colony. You had, these weird coins I never heard of, like Portuguese Johanna, Indian mohurs, and then more sort of, better known ones like Dutch guilders and ducats or ducats, as well as British coins, obviously. But the problem was that this coinage left the colony when people would trade with the visiting ships. So there wasn't a sort of stable currency that remained within the colony, except, of course, for rum, which we looked at in the last episode. And because that was very much monopolised by the rum corps, caused all sorts of issues, as William Bligh found to his cost. It wasn't until 1813 that Macquarie bought 40,000 Spanish dollars. So that's the answer to the quiz question. These are also known as pieces of 8.
Indeed they are.
And they are, of course, silver. So, and what he did is he then got a convicted forger to punch a hole in the middle, and around the larger of them became the holy dollar, and that was sort of, and you can see them, in various museums, the National Museum of Australia, for instance. It was sort of had, New South Wales colony or whatever stamped on it. And the one in the bit in the middle was called the dump. And that was also had something stamped on it. So these coins were therefore be useless outside of the colony. Now in the 1820s, finally, Britain provided its Australian colonies with an adequate supply of British coins and legislated that these be the only recognised currency in Australia. So that British currency was in effect used from that point on for the next basically 90 years until after Federation. In 1901.
After Federation.
After Federation.
Gosh.
At which point, in 1910, Australia created its own currency, but it was called the Australian pound. So it wasn't a wild divergence from what had gone before. So even then, its coins were minted by branches of Britain's Royal Mint in Sydney, Melbourne and Perth. So we didn't even have our own mints at that stage. That's sort of the background to the 50s and 60s, when momentum started building to shift over to an Australian currency. Various post-Federation governments had considered decimalisation from as early as 1901, but they ultimately took their lead from Britain. And it wasn't until the 1950s that the Menzies government finally recognised that there was an economic importance of doing so.
I.e. because it simplified the process of transacting currency.
Yeah, that's right.
Absolutely.
So, both domestically and internationally.
Can you imagine, how many hogshead to the pound and quart or something? I mean, honestly, it's just,
yes.
I know I'm mixing metrics there, but it's still fun.
Yes, but it's directly connected. Yes, decimalisation, metrification, very closely connected.
Does speak to the power of a system that is simple, intuitively measurable and understandable.
Yeah, intuitively measurable is exactly right. That's key. Yes, and they were, Australia at the time was, trading mostly with countries that had already gone metric or were always metric. So the idea of having, this ridiculous currency, which for people who are not aware, so the Australian pound, like its sterling counterpart, was divided into 20 shillings of 12 pence each. So not super easy to...
For the love of God, for sure.
Yeah.
I guess they just had to... They learnt the hard way in school and...
Yeah. Speaking of school, it actually took longer to teach kids how to add and subtract in pounds, shillings and pence than it does in dollars and cents. So a lot of energy and time was being expended trying to teach kids how to use their own currency because it was just so counterintuitive.
And prone to making errors, obviously.
Yes, that's right, yeah. So for kids it was great. For domestic, just everyday transactions, when you go into the shops, going at the petrol station, but also for international transactions. So Menzies, though, of course, he did not want to, he was obviously very conservative. He didn't like the idea of a currency shifting from the pound being an Anglophile as he was to anything else, he had to eventually recognise that it needed to be done, but he did drag his heels back then.
So the question is then, Conan, where does the hogshead fit in?
You're obsessed with that. Jeez.
It's a wonderful term.
So, yes, in fact, research had shown that decimalisation would save the Australian economy more than £11 million a year. It was going to cost about £30 million to convert, but obviously they would recoup the outlay over the next 3 years. So it just made... So the longer they left it, the more expensive it was going to get. So just get on and do it.
Absolutely.
So this is when... So in the 1958 election campaign, Menzies had actually promised to seriously consider decimalisation. Treasurer Harold Holt appointed a decimal currency committee in February 1959 to examine the merits of decimalisation, but they took 3 years to report. Yeah. Now, the committee recommended that we decimalise, and the government introduced the Currency Act in 1963, which nominated 14th of February 1966 as C Day. Now, I still...
C Day.
C Day. So, like D-Day, yes, but it was either changeover day or it was conversion day. No doubt they chose Valentine Day because it was kind of easy to remember. And the idea was that...
They could have got Hallmark behind them.
Nothing says love and romance more than coinage.
Indeed.
Yeah, and the idea was it would be a 2-year transition where the Australian pounds, shillings and pence would coexist with the new currency.
That would have been a period of confusion.
Well, yes, it meant that you had price tags that had both values on
my God.
And you could pay with either.
Or period of confusion.
Or a mixture of both.
Oh my God.
That's where it gets confusing.
Just extraordinary. Incredible.
Yeah. And so people were actually issued with little cardboard rotating discs that they would use to sort of line up. So you'd have like I've got to buy something for $2, but I only have $1.10 and I've got the rest in old money. So then you do this and go, that means I've got to hand over like 5 shillings or whatever. It's just sixpence. But I mean, and the wheel was all part of the PR thing, which we'll get to in a sec. But before we do that, we have to talk about naming the currency. So decimalisation gave Australia the opportunity to create an entirely new currency.
The kangaroolers.
And also they recognised that there was a public relations win in holding a public competition, so people could make sort of suggestions. Now, as you can imagine, that led to some silly suggestions.
Dollar McDollarface,
yes,
by any
exactly.
chance?
Yes. So the idea was that they wanted a name with quote unquote an Australian flavour. So they attracted about 1,000 suggestions and include the Austral, the Oz, the Boomer, the Roo.
Oh, the Boomer! Absolutely brilliant.
The Roo, the Kanga, the Emu, the Koala, the Digger, the Zac, the Quid with a K-W-I-D, the Dinkum, and the Ming, which was obviously a dig at Menzies. That was his nickname.
I'm really, really disappointed we didn't end up with the Dinkum. The Dinkum would have been absolutely brilliant.
Yes.
So do you think, Conan, ultimately they were going to go with $1, but the public relations suggested they needed to go out and take all these zany ideas.
No, I don't think they even
and then ultimately they would have gone with $1 anyway.
No, they didn't. I don't think they were even thinking of the dollar at this stage. Because in June 1963, Menzies, he looked at all of these suggestions, and ever the monarchist, and ever a very imperious figure as he was, he just rejected all of them and decided to call the new currency the Royal. And it got so far...
The Royal?
Yes. I don't know what and it got so far that they actually designed notes. And if you Google it on Google Images, you'll see designs of the one royal note.
The Royal. Absolutely brilliant.
I think, ironically, it had the sort of Aboriginal guy. Check it out. Mad.
I would have gone the Dinkum over that, I think.
Yeah. So, however, this met with widespread public disapproval. And 3 months later, Holt, the treasurer, announced that the new currency would be the dollar. Divided into 100 cents.
He probably threw up his hands and said, "This is insane.
Yeah.
We're just going with $1.
Yeah. And the public reaction to that was a lot more favourable, and it's likely he chose it because obviously the US and Canada both use dollars, so it was just... it's not very exciting, it's not very original. So Chris, let's take a break at this point and listen to what you have for us.
Wonderful. Okay, now it's time for intermission, where I get to talk about things that are related, but a little bit more zany.
A bit more self-indulgent.
A little bit more self-indulgent, indeed. So we've just been talking about the dollar. So the question is, where does the dollar come from? Well, the history of the dollar actually goes back to a town in the Bohemian Empire called Yakimov. Essentially, this is a little town in what is now the Czech Republic, which had a long history of mining silver and, in fact, uranium, surprisingly. And because of the richness of this town, the precious metals that it produced, the currency that was derived from this town became known as the Yakimistela. Let me just do that again.
Oh, beautiful.
Joachimsthaler. Okay, hey, let's just do that third time.
Were you raised in the Czech Republic? It almost sounds like you were such a natural.
Indeed. So these Joachimsthalers were minted for a very long period, and ultimately it was shortened to Thaler, okay, which the Dutch picked up, and then of course exported that name around the world. So what was very interesting is that, in fact, the Spanish also ultimately picked up on the term dollar, because as the silver production in Yakimov reduced, of course, the Spanish silver production increased, from the broader Spanish Empire, clearly. So ultimately, the Spanish pieces of 8, which was shortened, of course, to pesos, which is interesting, pieces of 8.
I didn't know that.
Okay, so that's the history of the dollar. So listeners, you may be asking yourself, where does that funny little S sign with the 2 little strokes running through it come from? The history of that, or the background of that, is still a little bit uncertain, but the leading theory goes that because, of course, pieces of 8 produced by the Spanish became the Spanish dollar, and of course that term was used over in North America and other places. The sign for pieces of 8 was a big P with a little S. And eventually, as these things happen, the shorthand for such was converging the P and the S. So you ended up with ultimately an S with the P ingrained in that, or ultimately the S with a stroke, a vertical stroke running through the middle. So that is apparently where the dollar sign came from. According to this story, I might now go to some more unusual currencies. In fact, I have researched a currency that's so obscure that probably no one's actually ever heard of it. The currency from an island in Micronesia, an island called Yap. This island, for the last 500 or 600 years, obviously the currency has moved on since the influence of the United States and other nations and trading and the like. But in essence, the folk on Yap used as their currency historically what is called the ray, and the RAI, and the ray is essentially a circular stone with a hole in the middle. So they didn't have a lot of obviously metals on this island. It was like 7,000 inhabitants or something to that effect. But what they did have was a neighbouring island called Palau, which had limestone. And so what they did was they would go and they would quarry this limestone into a donut shape effectively, and then they would bring it back to Yap, and that would be a form of currency. And these things would go from something fairly small to something that weighed well over a ton. And they would just sit there in the field, adjacent people's houses, perhaps in the centre of the village, and they would be gifts from one person to the other for big celebrations, weddings, maybe a gift to the great chieftains. These ray could be converted to shells, which would be a lower order currency they'd had in place for a very long time. And they could be like mother of pearl shells and so on. So it would be up to the chiefs of the island to determine that this ray is worth 50 shells, for example, and you could then convert it to shells and then go and spend that to buy things. What I think is really interesting is that in some respects, these ray were the very first blockchain bitcoins. And what I mean by that is that these things were carved, so they were mined, technically. A lot of work went into them, and of course, the bigger the ray, the more mining involved, similar to Bitcoin. And because they were a public-facing currency, they'd be this enormous stone sitting in the middle of a village, and someone owned it, and there was a common ledger within the village. Everyone knew who owned that unless it was given to someone else.
Right.
And therefore, everyone knew who the new owner was. And that's how blockchain works. Everyone has visibility on who owns every piece of that cryptocurrency. So I think, an oral ledger, I think, which was in place, for about 500 years before Europeans ultimately visited. They, of course, devalued the currency because they brought modern tools and were able to mine these things much faster. And, of course, that created inflation. And, of course, it killed the currency. Anyway, there's something in that story for all of us here in modern day times and anyone with a Bitcoin holding.
So now it came to implementing this decision, right? So we've got decimalisation is going to happen. It presented major logistical challenges, Chris. So, you had to design the notes and coins. They had to be finalised. The staff in the finance sector had to be trained. And everything from cash registers to petrol pumps had to be converted. And a lot of people were compensated by the government for this. So that's part of the reason why it cost £30 million, was compensation to organisations who were seriously inconvenienced by the conversion and who needed new equipment and training. It also demanded a major public awareness campaign. So firstly, it was three-pronged. First, you've got to convince the Australian public of the value of decimalisation, because obviously any change is going to encounter resistance. Then you've got to reassure them that the transition would be carried out as smoothly as possible. And then finally, you had to educate people about how to convert the prices. That's where we get into things like providing those discs, these tourney discs that help you do that. All this was overseen by the Decimal Currency Board, which was headed by the interestingly named Sir Walter Scott, not the same guy who 300 years before wrote a bunch of Scottish novels.
He must spend all his time at dinner parties having to refute that. Come on, man, I'm obviously not him.
Yeah, I'm not Scottish. Firstly, I'm not Scottish. Secondly, I'm not dead. And it was his regular appearances on national television that offered reassurance about the technicalities of the change, and is again sort of worth Googling.
I can see the slogans now. It's time to change.
Yes.
Change is coming.
Change is yes.
The times they are changing.
In fact, you're wasted in the
they employed Bob Dylan specifically for this cause.
That would have been a great idea. But the real poster boy for the board's publicity campaign was Dollar Bill. Have you heard of him? Does it ring a bell?
Dollar Bill? No, I have not. But it is genius. It is genius. It's like Buffalo Bill, but without the the bubblegum nose.
I remember that. Go on. Yeah, so he was a cartoon figure that appeared in every conceivable media for the 2 years prior to C-Day. There's a famous cartoon, and I will put a link in our notes, but basically it included a TV ad called Dollar Bill and Australians Keep the Wheels of Industry Turning. And that included the famous jingle sung to this tune of Click Go the Shears, making the point that we need to do this. We're for the sake of productivity, for the sake of the economy. We're not just doing this for the sake. Decimalisation, so it met with some resistance among sections of the public, just averse to change. But ultimately it was easy, and a fairly easy sell. People were given plenty of time to get used to the idea. As I said, it was a two-year lead up before D-Day, and then a 2-year transition period. So, and every issue that would arise before C-Day, yes. What did I say?
D-Day.
Did I say D-Day? That's the second Scotch talking. So this is a quote from Gerard McManus, who wrote in a magazine called Management Today back in 2004. He said, after almost 50 years, in terms of implementation of a government program, decimalisation remains arguably one of the most seamless and best executed reforms in Australia's history. Yeah, and it wasn't just the publicity, it was the minting of the coins, the distribution of the money. So an important feature of the new currency was that its coins and notes would be entirely produced in Australia by Australian organisations. So the federal government had been printing notes since 1913, but to produce enough coins for decimalisation, it was necessary to build an entirely new mint. The Royal Australian Mint here in Canberra was decimalisation's greatest single expenditure. It opened a year ahead of C-Day, and with help from the Royal Mint in London and its branches in Australia, so all of the other mints in Australia were still part of the Royal Mint, it was able to produce and stockpile 1 billion coins in good time.
Wow, that's a lot of coins.
Yeah.
A lot of coins. Back in the 60s, of course, as well.
by the way, Chris, do you hang out at the Mint much?
I have been to the Mint on a couple of occasions. Absolutely.
It's one of those things that if you live in Canberra, you go to the National Museum, you go to Questacon, you go to the War Memorial, go to Old Parliament House and the Art Gallery, but you can only go to them so many times.
That's right. When you run out of ideas, where do you go?
You go to the Mint. And you try to go there on a weekday, so you can watch the robotic. You can watch the people scurrying around, and the various robot things, including the Southern Hemisphere's strongest robotic arm, Chris, called Titan.
Strongest robotic arm.
And if you're lucky, you'll watch it pick up a 44-gallon drum of blank coins and pour them into a sort of.
It sounds riveting. Absolutely brilliant.
It's nothing more enjoyable.
I mean, that would be why I would come to Canberra.
So during 1965, the Reserve Bank's note printing branch completed the formidable task of producing almost 153 million new decimal currency banknotes. Ooh. To this day, the RBA is responsible for printing notes via its subsidiary Note Printing Australia in Melbourne, whereas Treasury, the government department, is responsible for the Mint here in Canberra.
So let me get this straight. Talk about a license to print money.
Do I have to include that?
No. I'd like you to, but no.
So when it comes to the currency designs, so there will be Australian wildlife on the coins and historical figures on the notes, and that's pretty much the case.
I think they're very handsome coins as well. Yes. I like them. I think the design still holds that well.
I think we all missed the Bandicoot that was on the 1 or 2 cent coin.
Gosh, I'd pretty much forgotten, for sure.
Yeah, and I think as a result, we tend not to think much about bandicoots. We think a lot about platypuses. We think a lot about whatever the lyrebird on the 10 cent coin. I think, like most days, I'm thinking about both those animals. But I never think about the bandicoot because the coppers are gone. It's a tragedy. And to make the transition easier for users, the decimal denominations match their pound, shilling, pence counterparts. So, as I was saying before, already. So, for instance, the dollar bill replaced the 10 shilling note.
So half a pound. Yeah, makes sense.
But the overall look and feel of the notes was radically different to anything Australians had seen before. Because if you look at, again, you'd have to Google this, but if you look at the Australian pound note, it was really very old-fashioned.
It certainly didn't represent a modern, new nation.
It certainly wasn't a 60s thing. It was a signal achievement that C-Day came and went with the minimum of inconvenience. So banks had closed 4 days earlier so they could convert the machinery and processes. And in the preceding 3 months, hand-picked, well-armed police had escorted dozens of semi-traders across the country, stocking the nation's banks with the new currency. So that alone was a major logistical undertaking. I mean, so in a way, it's a pity there were no sort of cool robberies, heists.
I was thinking just that. I'm thinking a train from east to west, across the continent, being hijacked by suitable robbers on horse.
Yeah. But when banks opened on Valentine's Day, Monday, 14th of February, 1966, they were able to immediately begin issuing the new currency to long queues of enthusiastic or simply curious Australians. Newspapers reported that even the decimal currency board was surprised by how smoothly things went. So we should be very proud.
A roaring success for the public service infrastructure.
So the success of the conversion paved the way for metrification in the early 1970s, which simplified and modernised our weights and measures. And
can we finally talk about hogsheads then?
Oh, here we go.
As a unit of measure.
Do you even know what?
See, it's a volume measure. 238 litres.
Good to see you take an interest in old Western.
Can I just say I like the term?
It's a great term, yeah. And we have to give credit here to the French. Basically, and I think it was Napoleon who came up with metrification. So Australia's decimalisation process was monitored by other countries, such as New Zealand and Britain. So New Zealand switched in 1967, the year after we did, and Britain didn't do it until 1971. Okay, and by the way, any idea when Canada went decimal?
I mean, I would have presumed at about the same time when they adopted the maple leaf and, they had that big kind of decade of reform in the 60s, I presumed.
It's a reasonable assumption, but you're wrong. 1858.
Wow.
Yes, and Chris, the US dollar was introduced. Any idea when that was introduced?
I believe the US dollar must have been introduced about the time as the formation of the United States, I suspect.
Yes, that's right. So it was 1792, just a few years afterwards.
Getting well ahead of the trend.
Yeah, definitely. Now, Chris, one of the quiz questions, as you recall, was what direction will King Charles be facing in? And you actually got it completely spot on, and you were astonished by your own knowledge.
I think it must have come up at some point in some of the commentary post the Queen's death.
Yeah.
I think maybe that's where I got it from. I suspect.
And you just tuned in immediately because
of
your love of Charles.
Indeed.
What is it about him that you adore so much? Is it the jowls? Is it
his passion? His
yeah.
passion.
His passion.
Sure.
What, for the eccentric things?
For Camilla.
It's a lovely, it's a beautiful love story.
His passion for gardens and architecture.
Now, as we know, even members of the royal family age. So over the course of Her Majesty's reign, how many effigies do you think, iterations of her effigy, appeared on the obverse side of our coins, our coins?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good point. And I'm going to guess that it was updated probably once every 5 years. So what's that? About 12 times.
And you couldn't be more wrong. It was only 6 times. And
yes, it must be really annoying, or it was really annoying for the Queen to go, oh God, they're about to update it again. Look at me. Oh my God, I'm old. Jeez, God.
She's been moisturising like crazy. She's no doubt gets the finest sort of unguents rubbed into her skin by devoted ladies in waiting, and still, every 10 years or so, you've got to have a more sagginess introduced into the effigy.
It's kind of depressing. The other. Well, I guess the other question I've got for you, Conan. I know it's obviously left, right, okay, in terms of which way the royals are facing on the coins.
Yeah.
But has there ever been any exceptions to that?
So the exception to this was the brief reign of Edward VIII. So he liked portraits of himself facing to the left, even though according to tradition he should have faced to the right. So he, in effect, abdicated before they went into circulation, either here or in the UK.
I mean, he was the king. He could have said, could you just make my left profile face to the right?
Yeah.
Seriously.
Yeah.
I mean, what's the point of being the king if you can't demand these sorts of things?
That's true. That's a good point. Well, but I suspect he was just being a contrary bastard. What a knob. I was going to ask, so Edward VIII, would you have chosen, the love of your life over the kingdom, Chris, if you had to?
Well, don't forget, of course, he did us all a service. Because if he hadn't abdicated, we wouldn't have had the King's Speech. What a great movie. Seriously,
that's right.
What a great movie.
And Helena Bonham Carter wouldn't have got, that acting gig. Sometimes her career sort of plateaus a bit. And sometimes you think, I haven't seen Helena for a while. And then out comes the movie and you go, oh, there she is. She's all right. She's doing fine.
Disappears for another decade.
That's right. So thank God for the King's Speech, as you say. I don't care about Colin Firth. He's in everything. So George VI was pointing left, therefore Queen Elizabeth pointed right, and now Charles III will point left. Are you excited about the new coins?
I'm ecstatic. I'm so looking forward to it.
And do you have a right or left side? Have you a coin with your face on it?
Well, now that you mention it, for sure, and I'd go something kind of a little bit more Roman. Yeah. I think but not the side with the Caesar, but me driving a chariot on we call it the tails side of the coin. Going into war and smiting someone.
So your head on the obverse side, and you in a chariot on the reverse side. So
indeed. Shirtless on a chariot and smiting Rome's great enemies. So yes. I like that.
Yeah, well, no, that's wow. Yeah, so this Valentine's Day, as you gaze lovingly at your significant other, possibly tuning out as they discuss matters of no interest to you. In my case, my wife perhaps discussing her dog, Charlie.
And you discussing coins with her.
No, well, you see, I won't. But I'll be thinking about coins. So as she, prattles delightfully about Charlie's behaviour in the dog park or towards his half-sister, which is completely unspeakable, I'll just be thinking that 57 years ago to the day, Australia got a new currency that helped define itself in that revolutionary decade. And ever since, we've been enjoying the fruits of a really well-organised reform. Yeah, and the irony is that while you're, spending that meal thinking about coins and whatnot, you'll be, at the end of the meal, paying it with FBOS. In many ways, all of this will be gone the way of the dodo, probably within a few decades.
It's very sad, really.
It is sad, because
really sad,
currency is a bit like a flag or an airline. It helps remind us on more or less day-by-day basis who we are.
It also makes the currency feel real.
Yes,
feel real versus just a number in a bank account.
Although it needs to be borne in mind that the cost of producing coins and notes is not insignificant. I don't know. But anyway, we're at the point now, Chris, where we can remind you of your failings in the quiz.
Excellent. My favourite time of the podcast.
But that's only because you don't write the quiz.
This is true. This is true, yeah.
You asked so I asked you in the first instance what a florin was. Yeah, so florin is 2 shillings, or otherwise known as 2 bob. That was the vernacular.
About 20 cents.
Yes. And the name was first coined, literally, Chris, in 13th century Florence. Yeah, so that's where the word comes from. Not many people know that.
It was an Italian coin originally.
It was well, in particular, Florentine coin, because obviously the country wasn't unified.
A city-state at the time.
Yeah, that's right. And it was where banking basically developed. Do you know that the word bank comes from the Italian word banco, which means bench, which is where a lot of the banking transactions took place?
Is that right? So it actually took place on a bench in a Florentine square, potentially?
Yes, that's right, yeah. So the holy dollar was made from...
Silver, pieces of 8.
Pieces of 8, correct.
Absolutely.
The first 50-cent coin, you rightly guessed, contained 75% silver and was circular, yes. And they changed that very shortly afterwards.
So it was just too expensive to produce. Was that the reason?
Yeah, that's right. So, because it costs more to produce than its face value. And the difference between the cost of minting a coin and its face value is a fancy word called seigniorage.
Seigniorage.
Seigniorage, yeah. I love that word.
I'm going to take that with me after this podcast. Thank you.
And no doubt you're wondering how to spell it. I'm not going to look. It's quite a long word. I'm not going to spell it here. So just check out.
I can see you Googling it, so let's just...
No, I'm not Googling it.
So you can Google it. It's okay.
You can Google it. I know how to spell it. I'm just writing it down so that when people look at the notes, the podcast notes, they can see it there.
I see. And Conan, can I ask?
Yeah. So
when they move from the round, why did they move from the round to the little kind of edgy, whatever it is?
The dodecahedron.
I was going to call it a dodecahedron.
You weren't going to call it...
I literally was.
Why didn't you call
because
it
I
that?
thought a dodecahedron didn't have quite so many sides.
Yeah, so it changed because even though the circular 50-cent coin was larger than the 20-cent coin, it still resembled it. Yeah, so it was a bit confusing. And if people want to see one, look at the photo associated with this podcast, and one is resting on my forehead, so you can get a sense of scale.
Indeed. Although you've never seen Conan's forehead, I'm not really sure you're going to get much sense of
that's true.
scale.
But just imagine it's a normal forehead, but much larger due to the massive brain.
Bonnet of a car. Let's just leave it at
that. Yes, and of course it was changed from 75% silver to what, Chris? Because I asked you, present-day coins are made from what alloy? And
I'm going to say copper.
Well, no, yeah.
If it's copper, it's always copper, and nickel or something, yeah.
Oh, now, yeah. So you said before copper and tin, which makes bronze, right, yeah. But it's actually, the silver coins are made out of copper and nickel, 75% copper, 25% nickel, whereas the gold coins, so-called, are 92% copper, 6% aluminium, and 2% nickel. There you go.
Yeah.
Yes, and the final question, which direction will Charles be facing? And it will be left, as his mother faced right. Okay, so Chris, the next episode, we will be looking at Matthew Flinders, won't we? Are you excited?
I am incredibly excited to hear something about Matthew Flinders that you didn't kind of learn in school, because he did some pretty interesting stuff.
Yeah.
Some real first for a navigator.
So until Matthew Flinders next time, I bid all of our listeners farewell, and I bid you farewell too, Chris.
Indeed. Well, look, it's good night from me, and look forward to talking to you again, Conan, in a couple of weeks.
Sounds good, mate. See you then.